Right, sir, thank you very much. Thank you, bye. Well, there you heard the bad news, I'm afraid, to tell you that Government House, I'll just repeat what he said, that Government House is surrounded. They have the enemy, I think we can call them now, about 200, have attacked Government House. They're not trying to shoot anyone, it appears. They're trying to
for the population.
Well, just a minute. If you take the gun out of my back, I'm going to transmit that news. If you take the gun away. But I'm not speaking with the gun in my back. Well, there's an argument going on now between the three Argentines. They've disappeared. They've left me alone in this room.
On the 2nd of April 1982, the Falkland Islands were invaded by Argentine forces who were claiming that the islands were theirs. 40 years on from the Falklands conflict, 4 veterans tell their stories of the Falklands War.
My name is Paul Mackay. I was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, serving on the frigate HMS Brilliant, and I flew Lynx helicopters.
Well, I'm Michael Ray's, and I was the commanding officer of the 22nd Special Air Service during the Falkland Island War.
Yeah, my name is Chris Brown, and in 1982 I was a forward observer with D Squadron of 22nd Special Air Service Regiment.
My name's Mark Thompson, and when I came down to the Falklands I was a B Company detachment commander for the machine gun platoons with the 3rd Battalion of Parachute Regiment.
While there had been rising tensions in the South Atlantic, an invasion was not fully expected.
It came on us very suddenly. I think up to 48 hours before it happened, I was unaware of this, and then we intercepted some signals, Argentine signals, and realised it was going to happen. So I rushed off to see Margaret Thatcher and said, you know, I think we've got to get a war on our hands.
When the invasion first happened, there wasn't immediate confirmation in the UK. Bob MacLeod at Goose Green used his ham radio to speak to people outside the islands and to let them know. His messages were picked up by BBC journalist Laurie Margolis, who'd been listening to the airwaves.
I just said, Bob, this is Laurie G3UML, which is my call, at the BBC. What's going on? And he came back, he said, hi Laurie. He said, well, why is the BBC still saying there's been no invasion? He said, they were in here at 6 o'clock this morning. I think about 500 troops all over town at the time, maybe more. Aircraft carrier, I think, in the bay, helicopters flying around. The governor's under arrest. There was a firefight. There may have been a few Argentinian injuries. The radio station is broadcasting in Spanish. Basically, it's all over. And the BBC is still saying they don't know.
Shortly after the news had been broken in the UK, a task force was assembled to sail south, which included over 100 ships and nearly 30,000 British forces.
Well, I invited myself and my regiment into the war because we hadn't been put down by the Navy as part of the original task force. And it was quite clear to me, and indeed historically, so no operation or war has ever taken place since the Second World War without the contribution from the SS. And so I telephoned Julian Thompson, who I knew was the brigade commander, who was going to lead the land forces battle. And I knew him from previous operations in Northern Ireland. And I said to him, Julian, I think you're going to need me, aren't you? He said, aren't you on the list? I said, no. He said, get yourself down here immediately. And we thereby got ourselves involved in the war.
The first arm of the task force headed to South Georgia to reclaim the remote islands.
I was the forward observer for the landings and the recapture of South Georgia. I was controlling the gunfire of the 2 warships that supported that, HMS Antrim and HMS Plymouth, in retaking Grytviken.
During the attempt to take South Georgia back, we lost some helicopters on a glacier called Fortuna Glacier. So the small task force was short of helicopters. So HMS Brilliant was then dispatched to assist the 3 ships on station, HMS Antrim, HMS Plymouth and HMS Endurance, to recover South Georgia.
The actual retaking just took less than a day. That was triggered by the successful attack of the Argentine submarine Santa Fe.
And the helicopters attacked and disabled the submarine.
And then a plan was put together to go in and recapture the island.
We then carried our special forces and Royal Marines from the ships into South Georgia to retake the island.
After the successes in South Georgia, the SAS headed to the Falkland Islands, where they were deployed behind enemy lines ahead of the full landings.
In my particular case, flying helicopters, by day we were protecting the aircraft carriers from Exocet attack, and by night we were doing insertions of our special forces in and around East and West Falkland.
And we landed on the night of the 30th of April and the 1st of May, 19 days before the main landings, and some of our soldiers stayed behind the enemy lines for 28 days with only one resupply, living up in the mountains here, were never found by the Argentines in the East Falklands.
You were the commander in charge of?
Yes, deploying the patrols and receiving all their intelligence, then passing it across to Julian Thompson, who started to develop his plan for the retaking of Port Stanley. And of course all that plan was really based on the intelligence that the SS had provided for him. The Royal Navy, who did a brilliant job, assembling a task force and getting us all down here, was only able to really stay at sea and sustain the land force till about mid-June. And if there had been a delay in developing the plans for the attack on Port Stanley, much after the mid-June, then the British would have had to withdraw because the fleet that sustained them would have to go. And of course the war ended on the 14th of June. And so it was really, we were up against the backstops when the war finally ended. And as Wellington would have said, it was a close-run thing because of that. And without the contribution made by the SAS, there would undoubtedly have been much longer to develop that critical intelligence and degrade the enemy's combat capability. So actually the SAS contribution was vital to the success of the overall planning.
The majority of the British task force landed on the islands on the 21st of May in the waters around Port San Carlos.
The initial landing was in dawn. It was half dark, what I call half dark, and the first craft on was a command craft of B Company, which was a little bit of a mistake because some of the craft couldn't get in, so they had to back off again and then come back in again. And then we spent just short of a week in and around the area of Port St Carlos. A Company was in the settlement and we were up in a place called Windy Gap. What I couldn't believe was we were digging trenches and the water was coming out and we were at the top of the hill. What's the water doing coming out? That's one of those things. There were some funny things like that,
While the main troops were landing, a diversionary SAS force were in place.
We inserted by helicopter at last light ahead of the main landings. We moved into the area north of Goose Green against 4 outlying settlements on the north side of Goose Green, and the concern really was to create the impression that this was where the main attack was going in, but without actually causing any damage whatsoever to the houses. And we were really concerned. We knew that the civilian population of the settlement had been cooped up in the settlement, and so trying to create that impression of a major battle going on, but not causing any harm to the Falkland Islanders was a great challenge. So, but we seemed to do that, and all of the signals intelligence that was fed back suggested that the Argentinians genuinely believed that the attack was going in against Goose Green. When I think the Argentines realised that something else was going on, they managed to start up Picara aircraft on the airfield at Goose Green, which came looking for us, and one of them managed to bomb quite close to us. But by that stage, we were moving fast back towards Sussex Mountains. And we managed to shoot down the aircraft before it got to San Carlos, where I think it would have would have been able to cause quite a lot of havoc with the main landings.
Over the following weeks, battles were fought across the islands. 2 para headed to Goose Green to liberate islanders that were held prisoner in the hall, whilst other troops yomped from San Carlos to create a staging post at Teal Inlet. From there, British forces moved across to Estancia, and shortly after, the battles in the mountains close to Stanley began.
We moved straightway onto Mount Kent and spent about a week up on Mount Kent. That was the first chance that we really had to gather intelligence and engage targets around Port Stanley. We were then retasked to West Falkland to deal with an Argentinian observation post which was on top of Mount Rosalie, observing the San Carlos landings. And then pretty quickly I was retasked to join 4-5 Commando for the attack on Two Sisters, and then the Scots Guards for the attack on Mount Tumbledown.
My group was tasked to go back down to Estancia and reform the machine gun platoon. So we came out of B Company and the whole platoon reformed in Estancia, along with the Milan and the mortars, all the other attached arms. They were all in and around the area of Estancia. And we stayed there for, I think it was about 10 days, something like that. And from there, we moved back up onto Estancia to an assembly area, and then we moved on to Mount Longdon. I was with the machine guns on the gun line. So we as you look at Mount Longdon from Estancia, we went to the bottom left-hand side, which is on the northern side, set up a gun line, and B Company crossed what we call a start line, and a good friend of ours, Brian Milne, he stood on a mine, and that woke everybody up, and the battle then continued for about, best part of 12 hours. And B Company had cemented themselves on the top, and our machine guns had gone up there and gone on the top as well. And B Company was still trying to probe through to push on the what we call the sheepjack area. But as we were getting towards daylight, A Company come and joined us and moved along the northern slope and took out the far side of Mount Longdon. And as daylight came up, we secured Longdon as a whole.
Both sides experienced huge losses during the conflict, which saw battles on land, sea and in the sky across both East and West Falkland. But on the 14th of June, after intense fighting close to Stanley, the Argentines surrendered.
I made contact with through the medical net, actually, and I had a very good Spanish speaker, Raw Marine, who was actually born in Costa Rica, and we started a conversation with them, I think about 10 days before the actual surrender. And I think on the penultimate day of the war, one of the doctors in the hospital, Alison Bleaney, because we were talking on the medical net, she got hold of, I think, Captain Melbourne Hussey, who was the civilian administrator for the Argentine forces here, and said to him, "This has got to stop. Call that man down you've been talking to immediately and start talking surrender." And he surely did that. And so I came down under a flag of truce and sat down with General Menendez for about 4 hours and finally persuaded him to pack it in. He was obviously in an impossible position, militarily speaking. So I had the upper sort of moral and military high ground, if you like, and so it was quite easy to put pressure on him. What I didn't have, of course, was the background. He was surrounded by a team of lawyers and other consultants about the means of surrender and what it actually meant and how it could be administrated. So he kept saying to me, "Well, that doesn't accord with the Geneva Protocol amended by the whatever it is agreements." Of course, I had no knowledge of any of that. I just had to wing it as best I could. But another advantage I had was that I had the telephone on an American SATCOM system, which had been lent to me by a friend of mine, and I was talking straight through to London. He had to leave the room and go and talk to Gaultier on another net. And so in a way I had the kind of I could sort of push him.
The Falkland Islands had been liberated 74 days after the invasion had taken place.
I was actually airborne at the time. We were actually over the sea, east of Stanley, and we were coming in for a mission, and we got the call over the radio of the surrender. We immediately were elated. What we wanted to do in our aircraft was to do a kind of wing over, celebrate, but because the aircraft was so tired after 74 days of fighting, it was perhaps a little risky to try anything like that. So we returned to the ship, and there were muted, not celebrations, but I think when we heard that the surrender had happened, there was a kind of feeling of it's over, but is it over?
After Wireless Ridge had been taken, we then went back to join 3-Para. And as soon as we got back, daylight started coming up. And we were then given notice to move. And we were to move to Wireless Ridge, because the next battle for us was going to be Moody Brook, and then the racecourse. So that's what the rumours were at the time. So we packed up everything that we had, and we set off, and we were going up. We were about halfway up, if my memory's right. We were about halfway up going towards Wireless Ridge. And then a white flare went up. And I remember seeing the white flare, but I didn't think anything of it, because I just thought it was a flare. And a few minutes later, we got told to go to ground. So we just stopped, went to ground and waited. And then the OC and the Company Sergeant Major split, because we were in a couple of lines, and went along them lines, and he came along ours. And he said, take your helmets off, put your berries on, you're only to fire in defence of yourselves. Right? The Argentines have surrendered. And there was, I don't know if it was elation or anything. I didn't really feel much, because he said, right, stand up, let's move on to Wireless Ridge. It was as if we were going back to battle again.
We were all hugely relieved. We were relieved, as I say, not to have to fight our way into Stanley. We were very relieved to have it done and dusted before the winter really set in. And I think the realisation at that stage that although we were cold, wet, tired and hungry, that the Argentinian conscripts were in an even worse state. And I think the Argentinians would have lost a lot more youngsters if the war had gone on for much longer. So that was a huge relief.
40 years on from the conflict, and June the 14th looks very different across the islands.
Spray! Shoulder! Arms!
There were once again military detachments in the streets of Stanley, but instead of being battle-worn and muddy, they were on parade, taking the Royal Salute. 40 years after, the British flag had been raised again, and it was still flying next to the Falklands flag. 40 years after the conflict, a reflection on the sacrifices made.
We who were involved in 1982 are equally grateful to the support that we have had both in 1982 and ever since. And I think that is a difference for me from all of the other operational areas that I've worked in, or that I worked in as a soldier, was that the Falklands was the one place where you absolutely knew that you had support for what you were doing from 100% of the population.
The Falkland Islands have spent 40 years thanking the veterans for what they did. And, in a way one can turn that around the other way, and the veterans should be thanking the people of the Falkland Islands for not having wasted the opportunities that they've been given by that, you know, hardship and that loss. And when you look around the Falkland Islands today, it's a modern, vibrant community of people. Port Stanley just got its designation as a city, and you know, that is what we fought for.
And the islanders now, 40 years on, are helping us, particularly those that have suffered, to come to terms because we can see the value, particularly in the youngsters of today, this generation in the islands. We did it for them. So it has been a very healing experience.
We signed up to do a job, and that job was to defend our country. That's what we signed up to do. Every single person that landed in the Falklands or came to or helped, all signed up to do a job, and that job was to defend our country. And the Falkland Island is part of our country, and we were doing our job. That's what we were doing.